Hello and welcome to my first Patreon video. This is going out in the very first month of my Patreon at Ros Clark Craft. I'm Ros Clark. I'm Ros Clark Craft here on Patreon, also on YouTube, Instagram, Etsy, all over the place. Because this is my very first month of Patreon, what I've decided to do is offer all the things that I'm hoping I'll be able to do on regular months, but offer them all at the free tier. And these will stay free forever, as far as I can plan ahead in life. They will always be free. And so they're going to be sort of samples so that people know what they're likely to get before they decide whether they want to sign up for one of the paid tiers. So this sort of video would normally be available at a paid tier. There will be two tiers, cyan and magenta. If you're at the magenta tier, you get everything. You get all the content. If you're on the cyan tier, 1 month you'll get probably a cross-stitch chart, and the other month a video, which might be this kind of tutorial video, or it might be something else. It might be a video of inspiration or ideas or all kinds of things. So this sort of video won't normally be available at the free tier, but this one will be. So I'm excited. What I'm going to do in this video is a project that I've been thinking about doing for a little while, and I've never done before, but I've certainly done hand stitching before, and this is a kind of hand stitching that I've come across quite recently and thought, do you know what, I can see a place where that will be useful in my house and a thing that will be fun to play with. And it's called Kawandi. So this is Kawandi. It's not really Kawandi quilt in the same way it's not really chai tea. Kawandi just means quilt, and it means quilt for a particular community of people living in India, and that is the Siddhi community, and they are of African descent, living in India. Now, I did not know this until I started doing a little bit of research on Kawandi in the last few weeks, that there has been this African heritage community in India since, well, for at least 1500 years. I think they originally went to India, some of them as mercenaries for military service, and then in more recent centuries, sadly, as part of the chattel slave trade. So they are quite a poor community. There's a history of oppression, of living on the edges of society, of being different from those around them. I mean, I'm sure there were some who intermarried with local people, but they very distinctly still have African heritage. And these people found that one of the things that's very important in a lot of communities that are oppressed, that are very poor, is of course you don't throw anything away. And that's where patchwork and quilting often develop, in those kind of communities where every scrap of fabric is precious. And so they developed their own way of making quilts, similar to, but different from the Kantha quilts that you might have come across. So Kawandi is not Kantha, even though both are from India, and both rely essentially just on a running stitch to secure the layers of fabric together. So it's a Kawandi, which means quilt. It's not a Kantha quilt, and it has this origin amongst Siddhi people of African descent in India. And it's relatively recently that it's been known about in the West. So there was an exhibition some 10 or 15 years ago, I think, in San Francisco, where two ethnologists from America had been studying in India, and they'd come across these people and they'd seen the quilts that they made and imported some of them for this exhibition. And I think there is now a sort of collective enterprise run by some local Catholic missionaries where women can take their their Kawandi to be looked at, and if they meet the criteria, they'll be paid for them, and those will go for the international export market. So they are sort of becoming better known. There's various people on YouTube who have made Kawandi. I'm going to put a few links in the blog post that goes with this video to some of the most interesting videos that I came across. There's one where you can see a little clip of city women actually stitching these out in India, and also another with an American lady who came across these in her 80s and travelled to India twice to sit for a couple of weeks and just watch the women stitch and learn from them. And I think she's really interesting. That's a lady called Margaret Fabrizio, because of her reflection on the difference between the Kawandi made by the city women in their community with their geographical and cultural heritage, their history of oppression, their tradition of seeing their mothers and their grandmothers and their aunties all making these, the difference between what they produce and what she can produce, even though she's learned the techniques, she's been out there, she's sat, she's watched them, she's gone back, she's learned from what they've said about her work, how to get it more. What she produces is never going to be a city Kawandi, because she is not a city woman. She's not part of that community. She doesn't have that heritage. And so it will never have quite the same heart and soul to it. What I produce is not going to be a city Kawandi. And if you want to join in as well, yours will not be a city Kawandi. We'll all be starting with different kinds of materials. We'll be using slightly different tools. Even though we're using a similar technique, we won't necessarily be following it exactly. I certainly won't be, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the deviations I'm going to make from their process. But even if we followed it absolutely, because we're not city women, we're not going to be producing a city Kawandi. And I think for me, that's one of the differences between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. I want to do this because I want to appreciate the way that this technique has developed amongst their community. I love the way their finished products look. I want to appreciate that, but I'm not going to claim that it's mine. I'm not going to claim that that's my heritage or that my work participates in that heritage that belongs to their community. And I'm certainly not going to aim for cultural exploitation by taking what they do, making it mine, and then exploiting that. If you make a Kawandi, great. I'd love you to go and do some of your own research using some of the links that I put in the blog post, and you might want to go beyond that and do even more research. And I'd love you, not just to, if you mention this on social media, I mean, I'd love it if you mentioned my Patreon, but more importantly, that you explain what the history of the Kawandi is, and that you reference the city people and the women who make these traditionally. So, one of the things I love about their technique is that you start with your backing fabric. So this is what I'm using. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, let's just move everything a little bit nearer here. So this is my backing fabric. This is, in traditional sort of patchwork fashion, a scrap of a Cath Kidston for IKEA pillowcase that I paid 50p for in a charity shop several years ago. I bought, I can't remember, 3 or 4 pillowcases. They were 50p each, and I've used them for so many things over the years. They made really great face masks because they're really worn. They've been used and washed a lot. It's really soft. It's lovely. So I went to see, and I had just about enough for the size that I wanted to make. And because you start with your backing fabric, you know exactly how big your quilt is going to be. And I knew how big I wanted this piece to be because I've got a very specific place in mind for it. So I cut it to that size plus 2 inches in each direction, so that when I fold over, you fold over nice big hems on this. We're not having any 1/4 inch seam nonsense in a Kawandi. We're going to have nice big seams. And so that is going to be the finished size of my quilt. And I have ironed that. You don't have to iron that fold over hem, but I have just for this finished piece. Now, what I'm going to do for the rest of it, I'm not using scraps. I could. I have a lot of scraps. I did not need to do this, but I really wanted to buy some lovely Indian block print fabric, so I did. And I bought 2 bundles. I bought a bundle of 10-inch squares and a bundle of 5-inch squares. I think for this tiny piece, I'm probably only going to need to use the 5-inch pieces. I might bake a bigger one. Although, yeah, I don't know that you see very big Kawandi. I don't know that you see ones that are sort of bed size quilts. And I think that's because you're sort of limited by the size of your backing fabric. And so if you're using scraps, you can't make one bigger than your biggest scrap. So what I want to do is, instead of wadding, we're going to use some of this fabric to be the wadding. And I might use some of my 10-inch squares for that. I'm going to go through the ones that I don't love. I don't really love this one, brown. And just build up until I've got maybe 2 or 3 layers worth of scraps. And I'm not going to worry about them going right to the edge, but I also don't want them to go over the edge. So I'm going to build up those layers, and I'll probably speed this up so that you're not watching me do this. Put those layers in that are going to be my effectively like my batting or my wadding, and then I've just folded the outside sort of hem piece over the top of that. You absolutely could pin that in place at this point if you wanted to. The city women, I don't think, have pins, and so they don't. You don't have to, but if you feel more comfortable, you can do that. So as I get stitching, I'm going to talk to you a bit more about why this is very untraditional Kawandi fabric, because although it's Indian, it's not Sidi, and the examples I've seen of their work look much more like they are using fabrics I would associate with Africa than with India. A lot more solid colours, for example, and a lot blockier prints when they're using prints. But anyway, I am using Indian prints. So in terms of tools, they would use, I mean, I was extraordinary when I was watching the video where you could see the city women doing it. Her needle was huge. It's like, you know, sort of several inches long, and it looked like you could literally stab someone to death with it. It was really long and strong and chunky, and the thread they were using was also very chunky. So what I'm going to use for mine is, I've got this pearl cotton, and it is 12 weight. I think that's right. It's Valdani. It's 12 weight, and I've got it in a few colours that hopefully you can see. And I'm not going to worry too much about the colours. I think the Kawandi quilts tend to be in white, so I might use quite a lot of this very pale pink, but I might also use other colours as well. And what else was I going to say at this point? Okay, yes, I'm just going to explain how the stitching works. So you start with your backing fabric that you've folded the hem over, and we're going to add pieces of fabric as we go. So our first piece we're going to add here, and I'm going to add it by putting in a row of running stitches that will go through the fold of the hem, through all the batting, through to the back, and I'll fold under the edge of the top piece as I add it. And then I'm going to add my second piece over the edge of that. So I'll fold over this edge and that edge, and I'll keep stitching along here. This edge not folded, so I'll add another folded piece over there. They don't have to be the same size, they can be, and I'll keep going. Sorry, iPhone storage issues. So I was in the middle, I think, when it cut off, of explaining to you how the stitching goes. So it goes all the way around in this kind of rectangular spiral, and you end up adding the final piece in the middle, stitching there. And sometimes when that final piece is added, there's a little bit of sort of puckering, a little bit of bagging, where there's a little bit too much fabric because of the way it's stitched, and that's not a problem at all. Traditionally they would add in maybe a few grains of rice or seeds or something like that, something that would be a token of fertility or prosperity or something like that. I'm not going to do that, and hopefully with my little tiny one that won't be an issue. So I think we're pretty much ready to start stitching. So I've got a pretty substantial needle with a sharp point. You could use something like a chenille needle. I don't know what this is. I think it's just a standard sharp needle. I'm going to put a knot in the end of my thread. I don't normally like to do that, but I believe it's traditional and it's what I'm going to use. And I'm going to pick my first piece, which is going to be this one, I think. You can see I've not absolutely bothered to iron all of these. Now I think, given the size of my backing fabric, I'm probably going to use slightly smaller chunks of this. And I'm going to start by folding it by hand to cover up the raw edges, and it's going to go onto this corner where I've already folded the raw edges, and that's where I'm going to start my stitching. So I'm going to put it in from the middle, and then I'm right-handed, so I'm actually going to stitch my spiral the other way around. I don't know whether there is a traditional direction to stitch them in, but this is the direction I'm stitching in. It's quite funny when you watch some of Margaret Fabrizio's stitching videos. You know, she is in her 80s. She is extraordinary, but she's using all sorts of fabrics for hers, including some quite thick and stiff fabrics. And she just has a pair of pliers that she uses to get her needle through when she can't pull it. So I'm not being precious about this. It is just a simple running stitch. Mine is slightly shorter on the front than the back, which I think is normal. I'm going reasonably near the edge. I mean, I'm certainly making sure I'm stitching through the fold on both the backing fabric and this fabric. I'm not really worrying about where my batting fabrics are. And then I'm getting to this point where I'm coming towards the end of it, and I'm like, right, I need my next piece of fabric. So I want something different. What about this blue piece here? And again, I'm going to just slightly change the size of it. I think if you had a normal scrap pile where your fabrics are all naturally different shapes and sizes, you wouldn't worry about this. But because I bought a charm pack where they're all exactly the same shape and size, I want to get, you know, some variation as we go round. So there we go, and I'm just gonna keep stitching in the same direction across top. So you can see it's just really repetitive and restful. It's quite fun. You don't get to plan too much. It's not like a quilt where you're kind of cutting out all the shapes precisely. Precision, not my forte. So I quite like this. It's very, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Improvisational as you go. The stitching in rows is what gives it a sort of formality to it, but then that gives you the freedom to be using just whatever colours and shapes you come up. You can see there are, I'm not sure I will have any on mine because of the kind of scraps I'm using, but they will have curved pieces and oh, let's have a bit of green, nice spotty green, and thin pieces and long pieces and all sorts of things. And as I say, quite often a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Solid fabrics. Now, I think what we might need to do this is make it a bit thinner, because it's just otherwise going to end entirely at the wrong place for the corner of the fabric. So I'm going to fold it. Do you see how I'm only folding the edges where I'm stitching it now? And then I'll come back and fold this edge, or I won't fold, I'll overlap that edge later, so it won't matter that it's unfolded. So let's just tuck, make sure that fold is properly underneath. And there we go. So I'm going to leave the camera on. I don't know how long it will film for, because my phone is currently telling me it has absolutely no storage, which is just a lie. Telling me that I've got 75 gigabytes of photos. I've got about 100 photos on there, and they are really not that long, not that big. So it's being very annoying. Anyway, I'm just going to leave it on, and probably what I will do at this point is turn the sound off and maybe put some music on, and I'll come back and talk to you as we go. Maybe I'll just fold in and put in a corner piece before we go. As I said, I'm not doing the fuller. I think if you are doing the fuller, you would do it at this point. So here, obviously, I am going to fold on both sides, because this is going to be seen on both sides, there and there. So hopefully that's going to overlap that side, and then it's also going to fold over and have a neat edge at the edge of the Kawandi. So there we go. It feels not terribly secure at this point, but remember, we're just going to be adding more and more rows of stitching in a similar sort of place all the way around. So all of these pieces of fabric will be covered in rows of hand stitching that will hold it all together. You can do, I've seen examples where people do a single piece of fabric around all four edges at the beginning, a sort of 2 or 3 inch wide strip, the same all the way around, and that looks lovely. I don't think I've seen any on the traditional city pieces like that, but you know, for your own stitching, if that's a look that you like the sound of, absolutely you could try that. And obviously for your own stitching, you could plan it out as much as you want. You could get a pile of fabrics that are all in similar colors, or you know, as I've done, all similar weight fabric and all block printed. But you could also do it with a real hodgepodge. I don't know that what you produce is going to be, if you want it to be machine washable, obviously you want to just bear that in mind as you're thinking about what kind of fabrics to use, and maybe stick to fabrics of a similar composition. So, you know, all cottons or all synthetic or whatever. And also probably, you know, because it's all hand stitched, you're only ever going to want to wash it on a delicate cycle anyway, and do a nice cool wash, and it should be fine. The rule for the stitching is that they must be no more than a finger width apart for the rows of stitching, but also for your stitching as you're doing it here. So I'm going to stop talking at this point and film for as long as it takes, or indeed as long as my phone will let me. You can see I've gone round the whole edge of the quilt. There are some places where I'm going to need to add more patches as I go round. This is where I started, so I'm not going to go down this line. I'm going to stitch all the way up to sort of, you know, less than a finger length up to my original row stitching and stitch along here. And I'll come along to this corner. I'll make sure that I've got these edges that should be tucked under as we go through. And it will be, and I'll go round and I'll stitch and I'll go round and I'll stitch probably a whole other row before I come to this part, which is the first place I'll need to put in a new piece. So I'll turn that under probably and put something that will come in here, or possibly I might put something in that comes over the top, over both of them, in which case I'll add it a bit sooner. But that's where it will go. So I think I am going to pause it now while I go and do a couple rounds of stitching, and then I'll show you when I've got back to this inner part where I'm adding the next layers of fabric as we go. Okay. So I've been stitching on this for a couple of hours. It's not yet finished, and the light has changed outside, so sorry, it's quite dark. But I just wanted to show you, I've obviously added in quite a number of additional fabric pieces. There are still sections here and here, a little bit here, where you can see the pieces that I know I was using for my batting that need to be covered up. But I've actually added in quite a lot more pieces than I really needed, just because it's a small piece. The finished Kawandi is going to be 9.5 by 13 inches. And so, I mean, you could cover the whole thing with, you know, half a dozen of my small 5-inch charm squares, or, you know, 1.5 of my 10-inch squares, but you wouldn't really get the full effect of the Kawandi piecing. And also just because I wanted to include lots of more colour and pattern and so on. So I'm just going to show you, I've been stitching round. You can see on the back of mine, my rectangles are not very rectangular. It definitely squeezes in a little bit here. So I've been trying to kind of bring this in a bit on this side in the last couple of rows. And you can see that I mentioned that sort of bagging that you can get as you stitch towards the middle beginning to happen. Again, it's a small piece. It really won't matter on this. If you're doing a very much bigger piece, you either want to be a bit more careful in the tension as you're stitching, or, you know, follow the traditional Sidi Kawandi technique and make a feature of that by putting something special in there. So I'm just going to show you where I'm at and how this is working. So I'm coming along here, and you can see this edge is a raw edge. So I'm definitely going to need to add in another piece of fabric to cover that. And I think I want to make sure I do that now, so that wherever the fold is, I'm going to have a row of stitching along that. I've not been worrying too much about placement of colours or shades. The only thing I've really been conscious of is making sure when I place something, particularly around the corners, but even as we're going in now, that I'm not using a width of fabric that's going to leave an end in a strange place. So for example, if I put in a piece here and fold my edges on these sides, what I don't want, you see, that would be okay, but I would need to have an extra piece here. What wouldn't be great is if I had this piece and it sort of came right onto that edge there, because it's not going to be enough to fold over, but it's also going to either mean I hardly see any of this, or I'm going to add a very narrow strip here. So I would just want to make sure I've got a piece that's got a nice overlap or leaves a nice space there. So I think I do want maybe this fabric here. The other thing I have done, not lots and not, you know, with a huge amount, certainly no planning really, but I have thought it would be a nice thing just for the sort of cohesion of the piece and sort of balance, is I've included sometimes the same fabric twice, here and here, this piece and this piece, but I've also just thought about making sure I balance some of the colours. So I might use another piece of this here. That could work. That's quite a good size for that spot. You see how I get a nice overlap on both sides, or I could overlap it with that one. I think I might probably do that. So I quite like that, balancing that with that. Or I might use something in a similar colourway, but not quite the same fabric. Because this is a charm pack that I've bought, I've not got repeats of the fabric. I've just got one square of each fabric. The 10-inch squares I bought, there are repeats in that pack. So if I were using those, you know, I really could repeat as much. I think I quite like that. I like that it's got a little bit of the yellow in it, although this yellow is on the back and you won't see it, but there is the sort of orangey yellow in those flowers. So I think that's what I'm going to include as my next piece. And you can see not all of this is lying completely flat, and that's fine because I'm not ironing the folds in every piece. I'm doing a little bit of finger pressing, but I'm not worrying too much about it because it's really as you stitch that you'll put the folds in and make sure that they go in place where you want them. So I'm not worrying about this too much. Some of these, you know, are not going to be visible. Some of them will be, but they'll be stitched down more precisely. So I'm going to come in here and just start stitching, and you can see it's not right on the edge, but it's pretty close. You will get in this kind of piecing, unlike traditional Western piecing, whether it's paper piecing or using a machine, you will get these sort of little ridges of fabric because we're just placing our fabric on top and with a fold rather than stitching along the seam and then turning it back. And that's fine. I'm really enjoying the feel of this fabric that I'm creating, and it really does feel like creating a fabric, not so much because of the piecing, but because of the stitching. The stitching feels like a really integral part of the fabric, and I love that. That's the real appeal to me, certainly, of a hand-stitched quilt, whether that's a Kantha quilt or this kind of Kawandi, or even just a traditional sort of Western patchwork quilt, hand-stitched. Whole cloth quilts I think are stunning. I'm not sure I would ever have the patience to make one, and if I did, it wouldn't be a great example of its type because they really do depend on neat, even stitching. And with this, I'm not worrying about my stitching being particularly even or neat. I think that's fine. I think that would be consistent, shall we say, with the Sidi Kawandi style. Maybe they are more neat and consistent than me, but the tools that they use, frankly, I don't think really lend themselves to great precision stitching. And also the fabric that they use tends to be a little bit thicker and stiffer than this and not lend itself to great precision in the stitching. So I'm really not worrying about that too much. Now I'm coming to another part where I can see there's a raw edge here. I am going to need to add something over this, but I think I'm going to leave it until my next round and then just add it in because I don't want it to come at the same place as this. I think there's enough there that I can give myself one more round of stitching before I add it in. So the other thing that's really nice about doing this with the Indian block printed fabrics, because they're so fine, is that it really doesn't make any difference to the stitching. In some of these places I'm stitching through maybe well, at least 4 layers. I think the backing fabric, which itself I showed you is very soft and easy to work with, and then a couple of pieces at least of the interior batting fabric and then at least 1 layer on top. But I can be stitching through up to like 8 or 10 layers, maybe, if I've got a fold on a fold, and so on. But it's really easy to stitch this fabric. If you've got that many layers and you're using something like a standard quilting cotton, you would really feel the difference in your hand stitching. But for this, I'm not really struggling to stitch, even when it's at a very thick part. I've reached far enough inside that I haven't got the hem of the backing fabric anymore. And I did notice a difference when I had 1 fewer layer of that, even though mine is not particularly stiff or thick. So there we go. I was stitching, sort of alternating the colours of the pearl cotton that I was using. You can see maybe here there's a dark blue, a darker pink, and some places there's also a dark green and a very pale pink that's coming, I think is reading cream, but it is really a pale pink. I actually decided I didn't love that, and so for the last few rounds I've just been using the brighter pink. It's not really bright, but it's darker than the other pink, shall we say. And I think I'm liking having more of that uniformity. The City Kawandis, I think, always use white thread. Certainly the examples I've seen always used white thread. And it acts as a sort of way of not just physically holding the fabrics together, but actually bringing cohesion to the whole piece. Because whatever colours of fabric you're using, you're mixing in the colour of your stitches with that. Your stitches are becoming part of that fabric and part of what is bringing harmony to your whole quilt. So, you know, you can imagine if you used, for example, just a really dark thread, a black thread or a dark blue thread or something like that, you'd get a different feel to the overall piece than if you just use a white thread, or like I'm doing here, using a pink thread. That's one way of choosing how your finished piece is going to turn out. It's not just about the fabrics, but also the stitches themselves become part of the final fabric that you're creating through your patchwork. One of the things that I'm enjoying about this is that you do your biggest loop around the spiral at the beginning, and then each subsequent row as you go round gets smaller. And obviously it's going to get smaller along the narrower width of your quilt than the long width. So there'll come a point where my last rows will just be in that direction. So I think I've probably done about half the width of this quilt. So it's definitely more than half of the stitching is done at this point. So I'm going to carry on. I'm going to leave the recording on for a little bit while I'm carrying on stitching. You'll see me adding in a few more pieces here and there. I may not get all of the stitching on this section, but I'll certainly come back when I'm nearly. So at this point I've put on all the fabric that I'm going to. I don't know if you could tell, by the time I put on this purple piece, all of the batting fabric and all of the raw edges were covered. So I could have stopped then, and I did think about it, but it just felt as though the middle of the quilt had become a little bit bare. So I thought, actually, I do want to cover up some of this. It's not quite a solid fabric, but in terms of what's showing, it more or less is. So I thought, actually, I do want to put something else in there. And I think this piece, which balances out this piece in the corner, but it's more of the blue part of that fabric than the red, just, I think, yeah, makes it look a little bit more finished. I don't know whether I might put something else over the purple as well. That's just quite a big block in the middle. But basically, that's what you're aiming to do with your final piece, is make sure all of your backing fabric, you see I've got a little bit there, is covered, and all of the final raw edges are covered. And obviously as you stitch, you make sure you've got it nicely folded on all the sides. I can feel underneath there is a little bit where my batting fabric is a little bit sort of scrumpled up in places, a little bit uneven, but it's not too bad. And as you can see on the back, I don't think I'm going to end up with anything that shows at all on here. I'll carry on with the stitching, which automatically gives an unevenness to the surface and a puckering, which I really like as part of this. So I'm going to carry on stitching around. I'll decide whether I want to put something maybe here. Might do. So this is the other part of that fabric. Put something there that's got a little bit of the red and the green, quite like that bit where it's got that. But I feel like by the time I've folded that over, you're not going to see loads of that at all. So I'll see what I've got and whether I want to put in another piece, or I might just continue all the way around with the stitching. As I'm doing this, the rounds are getting really noticeably quicker, so it's quite fun. It feels like there's really not a lot of stitching left at this point, and it's obviously all in place, so I'm not having to make any decisions really at this stage. I'm just making sure that everything that should be folded under is folded under, everything that should be covered is covered. I think my stitching has got less even and bigger as I've continued. I don't really mind, but you know, if you're somebody who cares about that sort of thing, you might want to just keep an eye on making sure that your stitching is straighter and more even, and so on. I wouldn't, you know, do the thing of trying to draw on lines with, you know, a heat erasable pen or whatever, because you're not, the whole point is that you're sort of doing the improvisation as you go. So although you could draw on lines, they're likely to get covered up. And if you were to try and do it as you added each piece of fabric, I think it would just take forever and be really frustrating. I think you do just have to resign yourself to doing it by eye, and therefore it will not be perfect. And if you're somebody who really, really likes straight lines and 90-degree angles, probably this isn't the kind of quilting for you. And that's fine. We're all different. There are plenty of kinds of patchwork and quilting which are about 90-degree angles and very straight lines, and I'm really terrible at those, which is why I'm really enjoying not even having to try. I mean, I am trying a bit, but I am not worrying about it when it's uneven. I think that's part of the charm of this kind of stitching. It's also, I mean, I have more or less had mine as straight lines, but you can see they're not all, you know, some are at a bit of an angle. I did start off with squares, so they really ought to have all been a bit more square. You know, you can end up with curved stitches. Here they're all at quite an angle on this side. Yeah, I don't really know why. That wasn't a plan, that just, you know, was how it turned out. But you absolutely can, if you're using scraps that are all different sort of shapes and sizes, it's fine. You just stitch them. I mean, you can fold them under to sort of correct the shape if you want, or you can just fold them under and stitch the shape that they are, or you can choose to stitch them into, fold them over and into a different sort of shape. And because of the way the hand stitching works, you know, you don't really have to worry about how those will piece together. You just smooth it down and stitch it down as you go, sort of automatically, if you like, bringing in any of the shaping that you need into your stitching, so that you will end up with something that lies flat at the end. So I think that would be a really fun thing to try, is a Kawandi with much more much less uniform shapes in the fabric. But for this little one, I'm really happy with that. And in the examples of Siddhi Kawandi that I've seen, there's a mix. Some are very sort of rectangular, and often you'll really be able to see the spiral shape in the placement of the fabric. As well as in the stitching. But some are much more, you know, all over the place really in terms of the shapes and the stitching, and well, the shapes, not so much the stitching, but you know, really free form and fun, because the whole point of it, as I said, is using up every scrap of fabric that you've got. And so if you're using fabric that's been, for example, part of a garment, it probably won't be rectangular, so it's fine, but you just still have to use it in whatever shape it comes and not waste that fabric just because it doesn't fit your nice, neat, rectangular design. So, yeah, I think that's good. I love this sort of hand stitching, this sort of slow stitching where, you know, I'm not having to check a pattern, I'm not having to consult instructions every 5 seconds. It's you know, it's a very simple but endlessly interesting technique. You know, it's very low tech, as you can see. I'm not even really cutting. I'm cutting some of my pieces a bit, but you know, you don't have to. You can just use all your pieces in whatever size they come, and it's just by the folding that you create whatever size and shape you want. So you can see how it would work really well for a community that is very poor, that has very limited access to tools. You literally just need your needle, your fabric and your thread. With Kantha quilting, which also is Indian but not from this particular community, they would use clothes. So Kantha means, I don't know if it just means clothes or whether it means old clothes, but anyway, they would use old clothes, and they would take the threads from the fabrics that they were using to stitch. So they would take a thread out of the sort of frayed edge, or possibly if there was an embroidered edge, take an embroidery thread out. So they didn't even source separate thread to stitch there, and that's why often as well, obviously, there's that automatically gives extra cohesion to those quilts, because the threads and the fabric merge together perfectly. Obviously you'd use threads from one of the fabrics and stitch across whichever fabrics you were in. You wouldn't necessarily only use that thread in the fabric that it came from, but nonetheless, all together your threads and fabric would be a sort of unit, which works really well if you're using very loosely woven fabric. So these fabrics, I definitely could get threads from them, but they would be very fine threads that are quite weak. But I guess you could use several strands. I don't really know a whole lot about Kantha quilting, but I do know that about the threads. So anyway, let's hope this is going to work out. I think it's going to be fine. There's a lot of fabric in this little bit here, but I think, yeah, we haven't got loads of margin, but we've got enough margin to fold over. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I think so. I might have to just make sure there's a little raw edge here that I just need to make sure that gets covered. I think it might need to get covered by that, because there's not quite enough of this to go all the way across. Anyway, this is the point where I'm thinking, oh, actually I would quite like to put in a pin, but I'm not going to. It'll be fine. We'll work it out when we get there. You absolutely can use pins if that makes you feel more comfortable. What I wouldn't do is try and pin your entire piece. So we talked about maybe putting pins in at the point when you've got your backing and your batting, and obviously you'd need to remember to be taking those out as you're adding your top layer of fabric. And then what you might choose to do is, as you add each piece, just to pop a pin in, maybe to hold down the folded edges on that piece until you get around to stitching them, that sort of thing, and take them out. But I wouldn't try and pin it all in together and then stitch. I think you're going to find A, that's quite complicated, and B, quite annoying, because you'll just have a lot of pins everywhere, and trying to make sure you've got them, you know, I just think the potential for ending up with a pin stitched into your final piece is quite high if you do that. So I would avoid that personally. Right, I'm going to do this line across this bit here. I think I seem to have abandoned the idea of adding in one more square, and I think I'm fine with that. Yeah, I think I am. So if you're watching this and you don't follow me on YouTube, you might like to do that. I mostly talk about cross stitch on my channel over there, but I tend to mention other sort of crafty things that I have done or am planning to do as well. I have cross stitch charts and one sock knitting pattern for sale in my Etsy shop, and my Instagram feed tends to be pictures of my dog or my crafting, sometimes other things as well, you know, beautiful places and I don't know, other stuff. I'm part of a thing called the Stitchers Collective, which is a group of cross stitch designers. I've been part of a couple of their charity fundraisers, most recently for Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, and in the autumn for cancer care charities, and also part of the Stitchy Goodness zine that some of the Stitchers Collective put together. I was part of their, what was it called? I want to say Woodland Creatures, but I feel like it might have been called something else. Forest Friends, maybe. There. So do check out the Stitchers Collective if you're interested in cross-stitching. So once again, my phone storage filled up, and so it stopped filming just before I got to doing the very final section. But anyway, I have a finished Kawandi. I really love it. I'm really, really pleased with it. There are a couple of things, just learning points for me. I think I do plan to do another one, a bigger one. I've got a different place in mind for it to go. So things that I want to bear in mind, but also if you're going to do one, you might want to bear in mind. I definitely like it better in the section where I've got a single colour of stitching rather than round the edge. You can see very clearly on the back, but actually on the front as well. I think it works better with a single colour, so I'm going to bear that in mind. I think it's a good thing, and I did know this, I just sort of forgot as I was doing it. You really want to allow yourself a good amount of margin. So a strip like this, you know, you think, well, I could do it and, you know, sort of turn over kind of 1/4 of an inch on either side and that would be fine. Actually, because of the way it works when you're stitching, you probably do want at least 1/2 an inch to turn over on each side, which would make this strip very, very tiny, and therefore probably I wouldn't use it. A couple of these pieces, this one definitely has very narrow turnovers on the edge, and one or two others. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. You can get away with it a bit more if you've got slightly less frayed fabric, I guess. But even so, you know, that is the sort of the technique. When you see the city women doing it, you know, they are not mean with their turnover, and partly that's because, so on this one, you know, you've got to make sure you've got at least enough to get tacked down by the first row of stitching. So you've got to have at least enough that it comfortably goes, you know, a stitching row, but ideally more than that. So that's the thing. What was the other thing? Oh, I know. I measured it very precisely for where I wanted this to go, and I put it where I wanted to go, and it's absolutely fine, and it's lovely and very usable, but it has turned out an inch smaller in each direction. I'm like, well, did I measure that wrong? I didn't measure it wrong. You can see exactly why. If I show you the back again, it's because this sort of hand stitching gives you this beautiful, you know, wavy textured piece, but it just means it's pulling the fabric in. So I just should have given myself an extra inch in each direction, and it's fine for this piece, it really doesn't matter. But for the next piece I want to do, I need to bear that in mind, and it's going to be bigger, so therefore it's going to draw in more, it's going to sort of draw in proportionally. So this is quite helpful. If I can say this was 13 inches and it's drawn into about 12, so approximately every foot I'm losing an inch, something like that. That'll help me just plan my base piece for that better. Anyway, but I'm really pleased with it. I did do it in an evening. It was quite a long evening. 2 evenings would be a reasonable amount of time to allow for a little one this size. Obviously bigger ones will take longer. Yeah, I think this piece was quite ill judged. I don't love this little tiny bit here, and the as I say, the turnover tomatoes. So it'd been better to have used a piece that went sort of another inch over here plus margin. But you know, I'm not going to change it. It's ended up, I was a bit worried because it did feel like it was getting a little bit bulky in the middle, and the fabrics were sort of coming in. And you can see there is this, the sort of puckering in the middle is bigger. And I could feel it a little bit with some of the batting pieces, but actually it lies completely flat. So yeah, I'm pleased with how that's worked out, and I love the colours that I've used, and I love the sort of feel of the fabric. It's really soft and drapey, and yeah, I really like it. So there we go. If you make your own Kawandi, I would love to see it. I don't know whether it's possible for me to set up a place here on Patreon for you to share them. You can certainly share them on Instagram. If you do, hashtags on Instagram are just a waste of time at the moment, I think. So if you do tag me, Ros Clark Craft, in your post so I can see it. I would love to. In the Patreon, if you've enjoyed this video, then please do think about joining the Patreon, because there are going to be this sorts of video as well as other things coming up. If you join the magenta tier, you will always have access to everything. If you join the cyan tier, you will sometimes get access to this kind of video, but not every time. Some of them will be for the highest tier only. So you can use your own judgment.